Dozens of civilian ships from more than 40 countries are about to sail for Gaza. Israel says it will stop them. The United Nations calls for safe passage. The question is, what happens when the largest flotilla in years meets a naval blockade? And what does that mean for America? Welcome to Safety Zone. Tonight we are connecting an unfolding story that blends activism, diplomacy, and military power in one of the world's most contested waters. The Global Sumud Flotilla, a coalition of 4 international networks, including the Freedom Flotilla Coalition and the Maghreb Sumud Flotilla, is preparing to launch what organizers describe as the largest civilian fleet to challenge Israel's blockade of Gaza since it was imposed in 2007. According to Catalan News, ships are scheduled to depart from Barcelona and Genoa on August 31st, followed by departures from Tunisia and Sicily on September 4th, bringing together activists, doctors, parliamentarians, artists, and citizens from over 40 nations. As reported by the Huffington Post in Spain, the organizers call this mission both a humanitarian action and a symbolic act of solidarity, demanding an end to what they describe as an illegal blockade. Israel's government has repeatedly declared that no civilian ships will be allowed to breach its security cordon, citing the need to prevent weapons smuggling to Hamas. UN human rights experts have urged safe passage for humanitarian vessels, highlighting the legal and humanitarian stakes, underlining that interception of civilian missions raises serious questions under international maritime law. According to Reuters, previous flotillas were intercepted, some by force, and in one case in 2010 lives were lost in a deadly raid. With such history, the stakes are clear. This is not a fringe story. It is a test of how far civilian movements can push against military orders, and of how governments and alliances will react. Tonight we ask, what is at stake in this voyage? What are the possible scenarios at sea? What could the global consequences be? And why does this matter for American families watching from home? The Global Sumud Flotilla is not a single ship, but a coordinated civilian fleet. According to People's Dispatch, it is expected to involve over 50 vessels of different sizes, some carrying supplies, others carrying passengers, with crews trained in nonviolent resistance. The word Sumud means steadfastness in Arabic, signaling the organizers' commitment to persevere despite risks. Their declared goal is to break, even symbolically, the maritime cordon around Gaza, to deliver humanitarian aid, and to force the international community to confront the blockade. For those unfamiliar, under international law, a naval blockade is treated as a wartime measure. Modern rules, outlined in the San Remo Manual, require it to be publicly declared, effective, and limited to avoid starving civilians. In practice, this means a blockade is not a normal police action. It is a tool of armed conflict, and that is why it carries such heavy political weight. Israel justifies it as a measure of self-defense, pointing to Hamas rockets and tunnels. Critics argue it amounts to collective punishment of civilians. The legal gray zone is this. While blockades are recognized under the San Remo Manual of Armed Conflict at Sea, intercepting neutral or civilian ships outside territorial waters can be seen as an unlawful restriction on freedom of navigation. According to Al Jazeera, Israel has previously intercepted flotillas in international waters, including boardings around 70 to 100 nautical miles from the coast. This sets up the tension. Activists argue they are exercising a humanitarian duty. Israel says it is exercising a security right. History suggests these voyages rarely end quietly. What happens when humanitarian goals collide with military orders? There are 3 main scenarios, but within each lie layers of uncertainty that can shift outcomes dramatically. The first is peaceful interception. Israeli Navy vessels could surround the flotilla in international waters, order them to divert, and tow them to Ashdod port. Activists would likely be detained, possibly deported, and the supplies inspected or blocked. This has happened before. According to the Associated Press, several ships of the Freedom Flotilla in 2018 and 2020 were stopped this way with limited international attention. Yet even a peaceful interception is not free of risk. The mere presence of journalists and parliamentarians on board means that footage of armed sailors boarding civilian ships could circulate instantly, sparking debates in European capitals and on American screens. Ask yourself this: if you saw uniformed commandos escorting unarmed citizens off a vessel, would you view it as legitimate law enforcement or as excessive force? That perception alone can shape the diplomatic fallout. The second scenario is confrontation with force. If activists resist boarding or refuse diversion, Israeli commandos may escalate to armed tactics. This was the case in 2010 with the Mavi Marmara, when clashes on deck led to the death of 9 activists. That single event triggered global protests, a rupture in Israeli-Turkish relations, and years of diplomatic strain inside NATO. The risk of violence, however unintended, is real. A struggle on a crowded deck, confusion in the dark, or even a single warning shot could change the story from a security operation to an international crisis. And history shows how fast that escalation travels. Within hours, embassies were stormed, alliances were tested, and Washington was pulled into urgent consultations. If violence occurred again, how quickly would calls rise for the United States to either defend its ally or pressure restraint? The third scenario is partial passage. In rare cases, Israel might allow symbolic cargo to be delivered under inspection, especially if international pressure peaks. According to Al Jazeera, similar compromises have occasionally been discussed when humanitarian convoys faced blockades. Such an outcome would not lift the siege, but it would give organizers a symbolic victory and allow Israel to avoid a bloody confrontation. Yet even this path carries consequences. If partial passage is granted once, activists may be emboldened to launch new flotillas, turning the tactic into a recurring challenge. For Israel, that risk may be as concerning as confrontation itself. 3 paths stand before us: one of restraint, one of confrontation, and one of limited concession. None is without consequence. A peaceful tow risks images that stir public anger. A clash risks bloodshed and diplomatic rupture. A compromise risks encouraging more attempts. And here's the direct question to you: which of these outcomes do you believe is most likely, and what would it signal about the balance between humanitarian pressure and military control? The implications ripple beyond Gaza. If the flotilla is blocked, European governments whose citizens are aboard will face pressure from their parliaments and media. Spain, Italy, and Tunisia are departure points. According to El País, Barcelona's mayor and members of the Spanish parliament have publicly endorsed the mission. If their nationals are arrested or harmed, bilateral tensions with Israel are guaranteed. The European Union, already fractured over Middle East policy, could be pushed toward new sanctions or debates at the UN. If violence occurs, mass protests could erupt across European capitals, straining police and security services. But the implications stretch further than diplomatic notes or street demonstrations. A clash at sea would amplify existing global divides. In Europe, it could deepen the split between countries pressing for a harder line on Israel and those aligned more closely with Washington. In the Arab world, the flotilla would become a symbol broadcast on regional networks like Al Jazeera, energizing public opinion and possibly forcing governments that rely on U.S. military support to take more vocal stances. In Africa and Latin America, where solidarity movements are strong, protests could target embassies, shipping lanes, or even trade negotiations. The point is that this is not just about Gaza. It is about the perception that civilians, not governments, are now testing the boundaries of international law. On the multilateral level, the United Nations Security Council could be forced into emergency session. Russia and China would likely use the occasion to criticize U.S. support for Israel, while Washington would defend Israel's right to self-defense. This diplomatic theater matters because it shapes alliances elsewhere. If Moscow and Beijing can position themselves as protectors of humanitarian causes, even selectively, they win points in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That competition over narrative is global power politics by another name. Energy and trade routes could also feel the tremors. Mediterranean shipping is already under stress from the Red Sea disruptions caused by Houthi attacks. Another zone of risk, even symbolic, pushes insurers to raise premiums, which affects every container traveling to Europe and, by extension, across the Atlantic. This is how an incident between small vessels and a navy can ripple into the cost of goods in New Jersey or Texas. But the ripples do not stop in Europe. They travel across the Atlantic, raising the question of what role America plays when civilian ships meet military power. For Americans, it is easy to see this as distant drama, but there are three direct lines of impact. The first is strategic. The United States is Israel's principal ally, supplying billions in military aid annually and maintaining naval forces in the Mediterranean and Red Sea. If confrontation escalates, American vessels could be drawn into a show of force, even if only to reassure allies. The second line is economic. Maritime insurers adjust premiums the moment risk rises. According to the Financial Times, premiums for ships passing through the Red Sea already spiked during Houthi attacks on container vessels. If Israeli waters or adjacent Mediterranean lanes become risk zones, shipping costs climb, and American consumers feel it weeks later in higher prices for fuel and goods. The third line is political. In the United States, Middle East policy divides public opinion sharply. Images of civilians clashing with soldiers at sea would ignite debate on Capitol Hill, in media, and in the streets. For a presidential campaign season, such moments can shift polls. Even without American ships in the convoy, Washington will be pulled in strategically, economically, and politically. Here is the question for you. Do you think the United States should stay on the sidelines or step in diplomatically if an incident occurs? What comes next? The calendar is clear. August 31st marks the departure from Barcelona and Genoa. September 4th marks the departure from Tunisia and Sicily. These are the dates to watch. The signals to monitor are also clear. First, official statements from Israel's Navy and government. Already, as reported by Haaretz, senior officials have said no ships will be allowed to reach Gaza. Second, naval movements. Spotters track Israeli patrol vessels and submarines, and their proximity to departure routes will be an early indicator of confrontation. Third, United Nations positions. If the Secretary General issues calls for restraint, it means the pressure is mounting. Once the ships leave port, every hour at sea could change the story. The question is not only whether they arrive, but what incidents unfold along the way, and how those incidents shift the balance of global opinion. This flotilla is more than a journey. It is a test case. It asks whether civilian action can pierce military policy, whether humanitarian symbolism can shift hardened lines of conflict, and whether governments can contain fallout when values and security clash in open water. But there is also a larger lesson here. In the 21st century, conflicts are no longer decided only by missiles and armies. They are shaped by cameras, social media feeds, and the courage of citizens who place themselves in the middle of geopolitical storms. A flotilla of unarmed ships does not alter the balance of firepower, but it can alter the balance of narratives. And in modern conflicts, perception often drives policy as much as force does. For the United States, the meaning is twofold. First, it shows that no convoy is truly foreign in a globalized world. Shipping markets are global. Diplomatic pressure is global. Political narratives are global. If a standoff in the Mediterranean drives insurance rates up, American consumers feel it at the pump and at the checkout line. If images of activists in handcuffs flood international media, American diplomats are forced to respond, and presidential candidates are pressed to take sides. Second, it underlines the fragility of the international system itself. Civilian actors are filling vacuums left by governments, taking risks that could provoke crises as easily as they could open paths to negotiation. That shift deserves attention, because it tells us that tomorrow's triggers may not come from parliaments or military headquarters, but from movements that start at street level and sail into contested waters. The lesson is not to panic, but to prepare mentally for how events far away can echo at home. Too often Americans dismiss these developments as distant sideshows, yet history shows They can snowball quickly into domestic debates, economic shocks, or even military commitments. The key is to recognize signals early, think through consequences, and decide where you stand before crisis headlines do it for you. So ask yourself, if civilian ships challenge a blockade and the world is watching, what should America do? Stay silent, support an ally, or mediate? And more importantly, what does your answer reveal about how you see America's role in the world today? Your opinion matters, because policymakers measure public mood. Subscribe to Safety Zone, turn on notifications, and stay with us. We will be tracking this flotilla as it sails, and we will bring you updates on what unfolds, what signals to watch, and what it means for you. Because sometimes the most dangerous storms begin not with a missile, but with a ship full of civilians crossing a line that others swore would never be crossed.